Well, so good to see all of you tonight. Happy to be with each one. In this evening's lesson, I'd like to again return to a theme of a series of lessons dealing with the subject of creation and evolution. And this evening, I'd like to talk about anthropology. This is, of course, an important area of study, and there's certainly a great difference between what the naturalists teach and those that believe in the Word of God, the Bible, would teach about the origin of mankind. Uh, the naturalists, of course, they cling to the idea that God didn't have anything to do with anything, and they deny all supernatural activity, and they tenaciously hold on to that basic principle. That's their religion, is naturalism. And of course, their explanation for man is that he is the product of an evolutionary process. Of course, we have to ask the question, does the evidence point to that or not? Does it support what the Bible teaches or what the evolutionists keep trying to propagandize in all of our schools and on our science programs on TV and so on? Or is it a product of special creation for a creator's purpose, which is what the Bible teaches? And I believe that the evidence and facts that we know around us certainly are in agreement with the idea that man was made unique and that was made for a purpose and that it's in harmony with what the Bible teaches. The answer determines importance and relevance of sin. And you see how important it is if you think you came from an ape or some ape-like creature and you're just the product of a long line of evolution, that you're no different than the animals that live on the earth, that then there's not sin. There's not an absolute standard for what is right and wrong that comes from the Creator, but everything's relative when it comes to right and wrong. You end up with moral relativism. It's certainly going to affect the whole idea about salvation and accountability and righteousness and eternal judgment. All of these things are affected if you throw out what the Bible teaches about the creation of man. The evolutionist position is that men and apes evolved from a common ancestor about 30 to 70 million years ago, and they point to some fossil bones and teeth for their evidence. They have many museum exhibits in almost any museum that you go to around the world. They have elaborate recreations of what these ancient ape men lived like, and there's just really, these exhibits are based on really the imagination of people and speculation and just so stories. There's extremely fragmentary evidence about any of these creatures that they're talking about, and yet they present it as a fact. Tell you all about their personal lives and how they lived. Man is nothing more than a higher animal, more complex in brain structure, but not distinct in a qualitative sense than any other animal. And that's the basic tenets of humanism that is around about us. And certainly it affects much to do with morality and the way people treat one another and racism and a lot of other things. The Bible position, not that slide, that man was supernaturally created, completely distinct from all other animals, and all other living creatures. Just a few thousand years ago was when creation took place. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 39, all flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one flesh of men, and another flesh of beasts, and another flesh of birds, and another of fish. That we are unique. We were created in the image of God, that man was created from the dust of the earth, not from from animal predecessors that came along before man. Eve was created from, the rib of man. So she had a supernatural creation as well. She's not the product of some animal that came before. The fossils, we were made a little lower than God, not a little higher than the apes, according to what David wrote in Psalms chapter 8, verses 4 and 5. The fossils cited by evolutionists do not represent stages of human evolution, but rather apes and extinct apes on one side. You have human artifacts and human bones that have been found, and there's no missing link between the two. These bones that they dig up are either apes or they're humans. They're not something halfway in between. And that's really what it all boils down to. There's not any transitional form. And isn't it unusual that there wouldn't be any transitional forms that you could clearly point to, considering human beings like we're the last to evolve to this great level that we're on, right? So we should find more fossils about human beings than anything else, right? But we don't. That's not the case. All the fossil evidence is fully consistent with the Bible, that God created each creature after its kind, and human beings are a separate kind. And there's been that distinction throughout the fossil record as we've studied about other creatures, that there's not any transitional forms that have been found. Man is completely unrelated to apes or any other proposed animal ancestor. Bible evidence against evolution, almost multitude of professed Christians do accept evolution. It's a very sad thing in this liberal age in which we live that many people and schools have compromised and started trying to modify the teaching of the Bible to try to harmonize it with evolution. But one that takes the Word of God at face value and accepts the teaching of Jesus and the apostles, takes these creation story in the book of Genesis as a literal fact, is true. The Bible says that all creatures are produced after their own kind. There's an unbridgeable gap between man and animals, that man was given dominion over all of the other creatures, that animals were all created to serve man, and that animals are not to compete with man in some evolutionary struggle for survival, that they are to be used and killed and eaten and so on by human beings. Man had a helpmeet among none among the animals. None were there from his immediate past ancestry, but as we said, Adam was taken from the dust, and to the dust he'll return. He wasn't taken from animals, and to animals he will return. But God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and he became a living being, and he's made in the image of God. And again, Eve was also created in that same kind of miraculous way from Adam's rib. So there is certainly in the scriptures, Eve had a unique creation, cannot be explained by any kind of evolutionary development from animal ancestry. The chronology of man's creation, what does the Bible teach? From the beginning, there was Adam and Eve. That's how it started, right in the beginning. There wasn't any precursors to them among animals. From the beginning, God made them male and female. That's echoed and repeated by Jesus Christ. If that's what Jesus says happened, we know that's what happened. And you have to reject the New Testament along with the book of Genesis if you're going to say there was some 4 billion years of development before there was Adam and Eve. The distinctiveness of human flesh is talked about, and that is scientifically true. The New Testament points to Adam and Eve as our first parents in a number of passages. There's no ape men in the fossil record, and we're going to look at some of their great examples that they're still trying to use today that are really kind of pitiful when you get to examining what they offer as evidence. There's no true transitional form anywhere in the fossil record. Man's the most recent arrival, and again, you ought to find all kinds of documented history about that, but it's not there. Many fossils of true apes, true people, true human beings, but nothing in between. So-called ape men are named after the place where they were supposedly found. Sometimes added on who found them. Let's investigate the stories here from the past. Nebraska man was one that was used a great deal at the early 1900s. It was discovered, these bones, in 1917 by Harold Cook in a Pliocene deposit in Nebraska, and the evidence was a single tooth. And from that single tooth, the evidence was submitted to the specimen to Henry. Here he is, Henry Fairfield Osborne. He was the leading expert. He wrote a book, you can see here, Evolution of Mammalian Molar Teeth. 237-page book. So he's the expert on what kind of tooth this was. But something else you have to know about Henry This Henry was one of the early members of the ACLU. And the ACLU hates creation, right? They work to get creation out of schools. They just want evolution taught. And they had a big test case coming up right after this tooth was found. And that was the Scopes trial in Tennessee. And I don't think there's much doubt after you look at the evidence that Osborn is a fraud, that he made a hoax out of this tooth to use it against creationists to try to gain some press and hurt the creationists in Tennessee and those that helped with that trial. And they, of course, in the 1920s, they were seeking in the newspaper some teacher that would come forward so they could challenge a law in Tennessee that said you couldn't teach in the public school that human beings came from apes. You could teach all the other part of evolution, but they didn't want you teaching that. And so they found a substitute teacher to be the test case. And so they had a trial about that, had him arrested and fined $100. He never went to jail, never spent a night in jail. But he was their test case to go to the Supreme Court and try to get this law overturned. And they were going to use this tooth in the Nebraska man to help in that whole manner. He wrote his book in 1907, you can see there, so he should have known the difference in a pig's tooth and a human tooth. They built it all on a pig's tooth. And all of the scientists, these scientists around the world, all jumped on board and supported that that was a human tooth. It was written about in the newspapers and the journals, alleged to be 1 million years old, the Nebraska man. Pictures of the Nebraska man and his family were on the front of the Illustrated London News. A 2-page spread picture showing what his wife looked like. He had a club like a caveman, all based on a tooth. The New York Times commented and run a lot of articles making fun of creationists and so on, and using that tooth and the Nebraska man to beat up on Williams Jennings Bryan. He was the lawyer, former 3-time Democrat presidential candidate, that was the lawyer defending creation in the lawsuit that was in Tennessee. And isn't it convenient they happened to find Nebraska man in his home state so they could beat him up with that? Look, this guy, your own home state, we found this ancient man, see? But it's all phony. It was all fake from the beginning. But there's the article in the New York Times in 1922. Scientists construct new million-year-old link. Isn't this the same kind of stuff we still see in the paper from time to time? They're still doing the same routine. And the evidence is still just as flimsy as it's ever been that they go with. Well, what happened in the end? Well, William King Gregory, he's another friend of Osborn's and scientist. He dug up the remains of Nebraska man. They just found the one tooth to start with, and they thought, well, there's very little chance they'd find, the rest of it. But they actually did dig for it, and they found the whole pig that tooth came from. So they dig up the skeleton, it's missing the one tooth, and all the other teeth are there. And it's right before the trial, but you know what? They didn't tell anybody. They waited 2 years after the trial before they told you that this Nebraska man was a hoax or a fraud or just a mistake, of course, is the way they presented it. Just an honest mistake. They said it was actually an extinct pig because it was in that sediment for the Pliocene period, right? I found this afternoon on an article. They found out it was not an extinct pig. That part was even wrong. In 1972, they found this supposedly extinct pig in Paraguay, still alive. So talk about it is false from beginning to end. Everything about it was false. And all of the leading experts backed up the idea that this was a Nebraska man, an ancient missing link that led to modern man. Well, they used this. Osborn was supposed to be one of the experts at the Scopes trial, but he didn't go to the Scopes trial. He knew the tooth was not real. He stayed in New York. Well, can you imagine? He got put under oath and swore and lied about it. So he didn't testify. But the other scientists, they did. And their lawyer, they did use the Nebraska man to beat up on Williams Jennings Bryant as being unscientific because he wouldn't accept this thing found in his home state. He wouldn't accept it. Bryant said the evidence was scant, and he pleaded for more time to see if this was true. And the New York Times and all the papers and the experts mocked him and ridiculed him. Of course, they've made the movie about that to ridicule Christians. And in the movie, everything in the movie is wrong. There are all kinds of articles on Inherit the Wind that's been shown to children for years. All the facts in it are totally backwards. But the Nebraska man, they finally revealed, oh yeah, that was a pig's tooth in 1927 after the trial was over. Java ape man. Pithecanthropus erectus. He had to walk. He walked upright. Boy, look, this was a big one. This is one they've used to beat up creationists too. It was discovered in 1891 by Eugene de Bois, and the top of the skull was found, a left thigh bone fragment, and 3 molars. There you see it in the museum. And I mean, they tell you everything about that guy, what kind of lifestyle he led, what his family looked like based on those 3 things. And of course, it gathered all kinds of press, and they trumpeted this all over the world. It was gathered from an area over 70 feet. They got the skull cap over here, and they got the bone over there, and they got the tooth in another spot, and they put it all together and said it was one person. And in that old riverbed, it was mixed together with all other kinds of extinct animals. They said it was 750,000 years old. The experts reconstructed completely from that scanty evidence, all these pictures you see that are in textbooks for children and so on. How did these unpetrified bones that they found survive and not disintegrate over 750,000 years? That right there sounds a little hard to believe, doesn't it? There were 24 experts that examined these bones. 10 claimed it was an ape, 7 said it was a man, and 7 said it was a missing link. And there you can see the picture they drew from that little scant evidence. And of course, they make it look sort of human and sort of ape, right? That's all the artists. That's just the way you draw it. It doesn't mean that's what he looked like. Well, in Berlin, there was a scientist that examined this evidence and says there's no evidence at all that these bones were part of the same creature. So, yeah, this doesn't work either. This Dr. Du Bois later said they were the remains of some sort of gibbon. He got all his press and everything, and he was in all the newspapers and it's in all the museums, but then the same guy that found it originally said, oh, no, it's just an ape, later on. So, but the textbooks, they don't take it out so quickly. It'll stay in there for 20, 30 years later before they take it out of the textbook. Textbooks, museums, they don't seem to get the word when these discoveries get debunked. So the Java ape-man skull, they found a second one. And this was trumpeted just the same in 1926. A breakthrough discovery, a missing link. They found out that it was the kneecap, the skull was a kneecap of an elephant. These are the experts. These are the people that are supposed to know what they're doing. Peltdown Man is a very famous hoax. It took them over 40 years to discover this was a hoax. And it was used at the Scopes trial too, because in 1912, see, when they found this, so they could use that and show these Christians are a bunch of knotheads. They don't accept the evidence. Look at all these ape men we found. Charles Dawson is the one that found these bones. He had some bones, teeth, and a primitive implement found in the area, so he said it was human. And he said he found it in a gravel pit in Peltdown, Sussex, England. So this one came in England, southern part of England. It's verified by these different paleontologists. They said, yes, this certainly is human. And this is the missing link, 500,000 years old. All kinds of articles followed in all of the newspapers around the world that they found the missing link. Here's what it looked like in the museum. You have a skull cap, you got a jaw piece, and you got 2 teeth. That's all they had. 500 doctrinal dissertations were written about this guy. Imagine all of these These college students getting their doctorate degree writing about that. And this great evidence. Whatever happened to the Piltdown Man? In 1956, it was exposed as a hoax. It was in Reader's Digest. It was in Popular Science Monthly. They came out with a whole article about it. Then it was all over the world, this hoax. And what was done? Kenneth Oakley is the scientist that was first one to say it's a fake. When he began to examine the actual bones that they had put together. And he found out, of course, that from different fluoride absorption tests, he found out that it was a fraud. The skull was taken from a medieval graveyard, the part on the top of the head. So that is a human skull piece, but it's from somebody in the Middle Ages. Then they found out the jawbone was from an ape that had died within the past 50 years. The teeth were filed down with a file. They were chimpanzee teeth. They filed them down to make them fit on the skull and look more human. And both teeth and bones were discolored with bichromate of potash. So they soaked them in some minerals and chemicals to make them look old. And then they put them together and built that plastic skull to go around it. And sold that, and there are people getting their doctorate degree writing about this thing. Neanderthal man. This is a famous one that came along in the 1800s. They found these graves in England and other places of human beings that had been buried and had tools and so on. Now, Neanderthal man, he's not a fraud or a ape, but he's just a human being. Now, how different are human beings from one another, and different even races of people, in the way that our skulls look and our mouth looks and our eyes look, and a lot of variety, right? One thing I saw on a video I watched this afternoon, it had a bulldog, skull, and then just a regular, run-of-the-mill like collie or something. Their skulls look totally different. You would not in any way think they were the same species, right? But they are. So how different can human beings be as far as their skulls? Can we have a little knot here on some people and not a knot on somebody else? And some people have a big ridge maybe here where other people don't. But that's in the variety of just humans. That's what you have with Neanderthals. 1900, they found these caves in Neanderthal Valley near Dusseldorf, Germany. They portrayed it as a semi-erect, barrel-chested, brutish sort of fellow, an intermediate link between man and apes. Further discoveries showed they weren't stooped over. They stood up just like we do. But what do you think those pictures look like? What do you think the museum pieces look like? They make them look as ape-like as they possibly can. But over the years, it's been found out, no, that's not right. Their average cranial capacity was 13% more than ours, most modern humans. So these were intelligent people. And the misconceptions due to these bias on the part of the evolutionists, and when they reconstructed these bones that they dug up, and then some of them were crippled with osteoarthritis and rickets and had different diseases. What if you found somebody that has some of the spinal problems that we see with some older people that are all bent over? We'd think, well, that's not like a regular person. They don't walk like a regular. Well, they had a disease. That's why. The more and more they dig up, the more and more they find out that if you, here is in 1983, the way they dressed Neanderthals. They said if you saw him on a bus, on the train, you wouldn't be able to tell him any different than anybody else. So it went from that to this. You see how they fool people? But by the time you get all of this stuff debunked, then they've got a new story, right? There's always a new story. They're always finding something new. And they make a whole new story, and they make documentaries out of it, and it's on all the news programs. But you just wait about 10 years, and you find out, well, wasn't the big blockbuster we thought it was. What about Australopithecus? Lucy. This is the one that I can remember back in the 80s and 90s. I mean, Lucy was on the on Time magazine, National Geographic, in the original pictures, look how Lucy was supposed to walk. The only thing different really is a little extra hair, and you got a skull that looks like a gorilla skull or an ape. But other than that, I mean, that's right on the way to being a human being. The feet look just like our feet, right? That's not true at all. None of that's true, because they've dug up a lot more bones since then. See, here's the original Lucy. And I mean, that they really heralded this. They had more pieces to Lucy than, like, you know, any of those people we were talking about before, where they just had a tooth or something. And so they said, oh, the bones show that he must have walked upright. Oh, they don't have the feet bones, though, do they? They had to find the feet bones on some specimens later, and they look like a chimpanzee's foot. They don't look anything like a human foot. But that part didn't come out right away. 1976, he said the angle of the thigh bone, Johansson's the one that found the bones, and the flattened surface at its knee joint proves that it walked on two legs. And that's what they trumpeted all over the news. It was on Nightline and all those different programs. The knee joint ended at the femur, and it was severely crushed. So you really didn't have the evidence to prove everything they were saying. And then by computer analysis, Charles Oxnard analyzed the skeleton and conclusively proved that it didn't walk upright. So all of that walking upright, and now it's an ape, some kind maybe extinct ape, all the way up until 2000. The latest one on here I've got from 2010. Here's these skeletons. And you can see some of these still are just little parts of these. These are the ones they're trumpeting today in the different magazines and science journals and so on, is that they would tell kids and tell people in college and so on that this is indisputably true, that these are, you know, hominids. They're human predecessors. Well, this Australopithecines that they keep talking about, extensive computer analysis, as we said, it showed that they didn't walk upright. So all of those pictures in the encyclopedias and the textbooks that still have those pictures in there are false. And yet they're very slow to take them out. Then there was another one found in 1999. The bones were scattered over a 1 mile area. How in the world could you say that's one person? Over a mile? You got a little piece here, a little piece there, and you put it all together and say it's the same person? How could you do that? And they said that it walked upright because of its toe bone. It had a toe bone like a human toe bone, but the toe bone was found 10 miles away. Now, what kind of fraud is involved in that? That's quite a story to have to believe, that this same creature got blasted and his toe bone ended up 10 miles away. And that's their big evidence. We're showing the big one, the ones that really prove it. I'm not convinced with a toe bone that's 10 miles away. Then in 2010, they found one resembled very much this Australopithecine like Lucy, another genetic variation of an ape. Here's a chimpanzee. Don't you think those all kind of look like chimpanzees? They look a lot more like chimpanzees than they look like humans. Look at their feet. They got hands on their feet to climb trees. They weren't walking around like human beings. But if you see it in the museum, they make it look as human as they possibly can. Their footprints will look human when they make a footprint, but that's not what the bones show. The brain size, when you see these exhibits, percent smaller than human beings. Much more in the range of what you'd find in an ape, right, than a modern human brain. They're diminutive. They're only 4 feet tall. When you look at the difference between the males and the females that they've dug up, with human beings, males are about 15% bigger than females on average. Among gorillas and apes and these things they're digging up, it's like 50% bigger, the male than the female. So again, it's not a human. It's not like a human. They have a sloping ape-like skull that they exhibit. muscular and highly curved fingers and toes for grasping tree branches and living in the trees. They have a locked wrist mechanism for knuckle walking like chimpanzees and gorillas do, instead of like human beings walk and like our wrists are. Lord willing, we'll have another lesson next week or soon, just looking at all the differences between human beings and animals, because there are dramatic differences. We're not close to the same. The organ of balance in the inner ear is ape-like in these creatures. They're apes. They don't have the mechanism in there to have their balance to walk upright. The brain size, look at the difference. A human, 1,400 cc's on average is our brain capacity. A gorilla is only 500. Chimpanzee, 405. Orangutan, 355. Big, huge difference there. So these are all things to bear in mind when you think about this so-called absolute proof that makes us all ridiculous for not believing it, because it's so concrete. Not concrete at all. All of these things are open to interpretation when you dig up a skull. You look at it, and if you're a naturalist and you want to promote evolution, you're going to look at a skull and try to see some kind of human characteristics in it. That's the way you're going to get all your popularity and your funding and fame. If you dig up something and you say, this could be a human, ancestor, then you can be a big shot, right? Don't you think that scientists and archaeologists, that they have exactly the same kind of fleshly motivations that everybody else has in every other profession? They do. They lie just like other people lie. And they exaggerate just like other people exaggerate. And they're interested in fame and money and all of the attention just like other people are. They're no different. Just because they wear a lab coat doesn't make them any different. They're subject to all of those same things. And you see it happen. Here's what Henry Gee, he is the chief science writer for the Nature Journal. We see that thing where you have the chimpanzee and the ape, and then it gradually gets more and more human-like, and they act like that's what evolution proves, where those intermediate creatures don't exist. Right? They don't exist. It's all phony. But we see that all the time. He says this about laying out these bones and so on. To take a line of fossils and claim that they represent a lineage from ape to man, this is from an evolutionist, one of their big writers saying this, is not scientific hypotheses that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story. That's the truth. It's just a story that they made up based on some bones and a tooth or whatever. It doesn't have any more scientific validity than that. We can all make up a story. It might be amusing, perhaps even instructive, but it's not scientific. You can't prove it, right? You cannot prove it. You can draw a picture, but it doesn't prove that's what it looked like even. Warns us about in 2 Timothy 4:4. And they will turn away their ears from the truth and will turn aside to myths. People will do that, turn away from the Bible and believe these human myths and made up stories. In 2 Timothy 3 and verse 7, there'll be those that are always learning. They may have a doctor's degree, right? They may spend their whole life studying pig teeth and not know the difference, though, between a pig tooth and a human. Never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. People can be so prejudiced they cannot see the evidence objectively. In 1 Timothy 6:20, "O Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to you, avoid worldly and empty chatter and opposing arguments of what is falsely called knowledge." Be on guard. Well, let's be on guard. Let's teach our children to be on guard. There are so many good creation science websites that have detailed articles on all of these different things that you should share with your children. They ought to go off to school, if they do go to school, prepared with the evidence to know what their teachers are trying to sell them when they get to school. They shouldn't be shocked because we know they're going to be taught this stuff. We ought to prepare them ahead of time. Well, I hope, brethren, that we'll all recognize we are created in the image of God, that we are made uniquely with a free will and with a responsibility to behave ourselves according to our Creator's dictates, that there is such a thing as sin, and there is also something made possible for all of us, and that's salvation from sin. If you're here tonight and you've not obeyed the gospel, if you need to respond to the Lord's invitation in any way, we want to encourage you to come as together we stand and sing. Art thou sweet?